Okay, so I think we can slowly start preparing for our next session. And our next speaker is Andy Huneycutt from United States. So we had Finland, Belgium, and now we are moving to United States. Andy is a collaboration specialist and Microsoft MVP for Office Apps and Services. In his today's session, we are going to talk about understanding access control and sharing in Microsoft Teams, which is, I think, if we do like a full circle from what we heard from Carolina at the beginning, where people really need to be educated to understand all the features, I think this session will come us handy to better understand how and why how we can control the system of Microsoft Teams. So Andy, I hope you're here with me now.
Yes, hello.
Hello, Andy. So the floor is yours.
All right, make sure coming through loud and clear. And give me just 1 second, get my screen pulled up here. Thank you so much for having me. Today, I'm here to talk about understanding access control and sharing in Microsoft Teams. Uh, there's a slide here, a little bit of contact information, a little bit about me. Microsoft MVP, specialize in Office apps and services. Started in SharePoint, since worked my way into the awesome world of Microsoft Teams, as well as everything Microsoft 365. Based out of Charlotte, North Carolina. You'll find me on Twitter and LinkedIn, and run my own website and got my own YouTube channel. I'm pretty much everywhere. I know a lot of you have been connecting with me for the last couple of days. So that's been really cool. Phone's been buzzing nonstop. New requests on LinkedIn and Twitter. So feel free to reach out and communicate with me through there. But with no further ado, let's talk about access control and in Microsoft Teams. So there are a lot of settings that allow us to govern how users work in Microsoft Teams. For the most part, Teams is set up as a self-service application, and users can go, they can create teams, they can add members, they can add guests to those teams, they can create channels, and they can work with content inside of there. But we need to understand the controls. How do we manage that membership? How do we manage that membership not only in Teams, but by extension through Microsoft 365 groups, as well as SharePoint sites? So we're going to talk about some of those controls and what we can actually do. We also want to talk about how we can manage guest access. Some of this is going to be done through the admin portal. So what are some of the options that we have to manage guest access, to configure that so that we can avoid unwanted sharing, data leaks, and sensitive information getting out of the system. We'll talk about best practices as we're moving throughout this, and we're also going to talk about how to configure secure sharing. Now, that's going to supplement a talk that I did for Syskit here recently. They have a recorded webinar. There's a link in the presentation on that. There's going to be a little bit of overlap with that talk because it's important to understand some of the sharing options that users have. But I'm not going to dive too deep into that. I'm going to defer to that other webinar to go back and get some of that information. And again, there's a link in the PowerPoint with that. So starting off, just a couple of key things that we need to be aware of. Every user in your organization has to have a Teams license before they can use Teams. This is enabled by default from Microsoft. So if you're adding somebody as a member of the organization, they're a licensed user, they're going to be able to use Teams right away unless you take that license away from them. The exception to that's going to be if you're joining meetings. You create a meeting with the default settings, users are going to be able to join in as a guest anonymously inside of that meeting. But we have some controls and policies that we can put in place for that. But when you're licensing users, the Teams license is automatically applied. So say, for instance, you have a Microsoft 365 E3 license, you apply that to a user. The option for Teams is enabled by default unless an admin specifically removes that license from the user. Now, a couple of things that I want to define up front as it relates to this. When we're talking about managing access, there's a number of different levels. There are licensed users, there are people that are part of our organization, but we also have external access. These are people that work with maybe partners or other businesses that we're associated with. It's federation, so it allows them to participate in Teams, but there's some limits as to what they're going to be able to do. On the other side of that, we have guest access. This allows us to invite people from outside of the organization, outside of maybe one of those partner entities, and they are going to be able to participate inside of Teams. Guest access also means that they're going to be creating a guest account inside of our Azure Active Directory, and so they're going to be listed in our Azure AD. This allows us to invite people from outside of our organization into teams, but they get access to like the entire team. So that's really what we want to dive into is guest access, controlling some of that access from people that don't work for our company, and limiting what they can do and what they can't do inside of there. So just a couple of things to point out, some high-level differences between external access and guest-based access. External access users, they can search for people within our organization, whereas guests are going to be limited for some of that. External access users, though, with the default settings, they're limited in their ability to share files, whereas a guest user could share files with the default settings unless we change those and added in different policies. And then things people outside of the organization can do. So if you're an external access user accessing Teams resources or being added to a chat group, a lot of that's actually limited, whereas guests are actually able to do that by default. So really the guidance from Microsoft is it's better to use guest access in many situations to add people from outside of the organization to participate inside of your Microsoft Teams tenant. So use guest access to add somebody from outside the organization. They're going to be able to participate in chats. They're going to be able to participate in calls. They can join in meetings. They can participate in your teams and the channels inside of there. And they would also be able to do things like collaborate inside of files that are being shared in there as well. Essentially, a guest user has almost all the same capabilities that a native team member would have as somebody that's part of the organization. So we have a number of organizational-wide settings that we can actually define through the Teams Admin Center, through the SharePoint Admin Center, but also through the Microsoft 365 Admin Center. That's going to allow us to put some controls in place. And unfortunately, we got to move from here to there and back and forth in order to configure all of these different settings. But we do have some controls for things like that external access or guest access. We have Teams policies that we can put in place. We have some SharePoint settings that we can define. We have some Microsoft 365 group settings that we can define. We have some Exchange and email-based settings that we can define, and that's going to help us to have a comprehensive overview of everything that we can do to really control some of the guest access. So let's dive in and let's talk a little bit about managing Teams membership. Now, this is going to be kind of introductory. We want to build up as we're kind of moving through this. So we're going to start with some of the basics, and then we're going to get a little bit deeper and a little more complex as we move along. So here, let's talk about the controls that like an end user might have for creating a team, and then how that's going to apply to things like Microsoft 365 groups and SharePoint. So the first thing to point out, Microsoft Teams. Desktop application, you can use it in your web browser, you can use it on your mobile device, and it does a lot of things. It does meetings, it does chat, it does Teams, it allows us to work and manage content. It also has calling built into it. You can work with tasks, whether they're private tasks and to-do or team tasks through Planner. You can work with Power Automate, you can work with Power Apps. It's basically one-stop shop for everything Microsoft 365. But Teams essentially is built on top of SharePoint. Behind every team is a SharePoint site. And that SharePoint site is connected to a Microsoft 365 group. And that Microsoft 365 group allows us to take the membership of the team and pass that to the SharePoint site and then other applications in Microsoft 365, like Planner for task management, like OneNote for collaboration. And in some cases, even like a shared mailbox in Outlook, and a shared calendar that's actually powered by Exchange. And that can even extend into some other applications like Power BI or Microsoft Stream. So Teams is built on top of SharePoint. SharePoint uses the Microsoft 365 group model to kind of control the membership and bring everything together. So when we start creating teams, we're actually creating SharePoint sites as well. And so you're going to see a little bit of sprawl in the beginning, especially if you have self-service Teams creation turned on. There's going to be a number of SharePoint sites that just kind of sprout almost instantly when you start working with this. From a governance perspective, taking a light hand approach, running reporting, maintaining this from the admin level and central admin is going to be a way to work with this. And then there's some tools that can help us to manage some of this as well. But this is kind of the architecture: Teams, SharePoint, Microsoft 365 groups. So when you're working with Teams, that SharePoint site is in the back end. That's where the files that are associated with your channels are actually stored. And by being a member of the team, whether you're a guest, a member, or an owner, you have access to the SharePoint site that powers that team. So you can visit that SharePoint site, and you're going to be able to go to the documents library. You're going to be able to see folders that relate to the various channels inside of the document library. And I want to point out the permissions. If you look at the permissions for that SharePoint site, you're going to see owners, members, and visitors. Tried and true SharePoint permissions. Owners have full control, members have edit permission level, and then your visitors typically have the read-only permission level. But if you expand those groups, you're going to notice that there's a Microsoft 365 group nested in there. So I have a site owners group in this site, but there's a Widgets Corp PMO owners Microsoft 365 group, and that comes from my Microsoft team. I created the team, that's the name of the team. I have owners, members, and guests there, and they've nested those inside of the SharePoint site. So the membership of Teams passes into SharePoint, and you have access in both places. But I also want to point out that this is a standalone SharePoint site, and you can have permissions for just that site that do not apply in Microsoft Teams. So like I can have people that work in Teams and build and curate content in Teams and publish it to this site, and then I can have other people that have access to this site, but they don't have access to the team. So I can have some overlap there. But if I grant somebody access to the site, if they go to the document library, they're going to see the folders that relate to the channels and the files that are stored there. They might have access to that. You don't want to create too many unique permissions on some of that stuff, because that could impact your ability to work in Teams. But it is possible to have both Microsoft Teams access here and then SharePoint access and be independent of one another. So going back to Teams and starting really from there, membership of Teams is controlled by the owners. The owner creates the team. Microsoft set it up for self-service creation. The team is provisioned, and then the owner of the team can go in and they can add members. They can add members and they can add guests. So the default settings allow us to add both, whether they're part of the organization or whether they're external to the organization. And if you're not a team owner, if maybe you're a member, you can submit a request and the owner can deny it or accept it and grant you access to the site. But the team can also be public or private within the organization. If it's public, anybody can request access to join it. If it's private, we can have it show up in the search. We can also minimize it actually being visible in the search, and then owners would control who can join, but also there would be the ability to submit a request and then join from there. So we have a couple of different levels there. Every member, though, in a team has a role. So if we go in to manage the team, you're going to see owners. You can have up to 100 owners per team, and then you're going to have the members underneath there. And members and guests have the same level of controls initially, unless we make some changes to that. So limits inside of there. Originally, the limit for the number of members was like 5,000. They've increased that. I can't remember if it's 10,000 or 25,000 now. The number's bounced around a little bit, but it's pretty significant. You can have a ton of people that are actually a part of that team. But another thing to point out is within the team, we can also have standard channels. That means they're available for everybody that's part of the team. And then we can have private channels, which are available to certain members of the team, but not everybody. We can narrow down who has access within there if we need. So the standard channels are open for everybody. They're searchable by everybody. You have your posts, you have your files, you have your additional tabs. And if you're a member of the team, if you're a guest, you have access to those standard channels, and you're going to be able to work with it from there. Private channels, though, as I mentioned, that is for the subset of owners, or subset of users rather. If you're part of the larger team, you're going to be able to access the private channel and work with it. Think about private channels from the perspective of, we've got a team and our managers need a place to privately work. A private channel can do that. It gives them a place to have conversations outside of the rest of the team while still being a member of the team and still being able to participate and keeping everything in a single team versus having to create many different teams. But one thing about the private channels is you're going to have a separate SharePoint site provisioned for each private channel. And right now you can have 30 private channels per team. So if you maximize and use all 30, you're going to have one main SharePoint site for the main team, and then an additional 30 SharePoint sites on the back end. And at last review, a lot of those private SharePoint sites don't show up in the admin center by default. There's some PowerShell reporting that we can do around that, but a lot of those don't show up in the admin center by default. So just kind of an FYI there. Now, there is something that's really cool that you can do with Azure AD, and that's dynamic membership. Now, this does involve a little bit of query rules, but we can actually manage the membership of our teams dynamically. So rather than having the owner add and remove users and guests, we would actually have the ability to do dynamic membership. And that just allows us to specify some rules, and we can have 5 expressions within the rule builder, and anybody that meets that criteria, anybody that evaluates true based off of that rule, would automatically be added to the Microsoft 365 group, and in turn they would be passed into the Microsoft team, which is a great way to kind of let some of the system tools help us to build some of these teams. But the drawback to this is that you need a premium P1 license for Azure AD in order to use that. So there's some additional licensing there. But that is an option that you have. Now, as I mentioned previously, the SharePoint site does give you the ability to add owners, members, and visitors, and you don't have to add them to the team, but if you add them to the site, they do have access to the resources that are inside of the site. So that's just to be aware of, and we've reiterated that. So let's talk a little bit about guest access and sharing, and some of the things that we can do now to start controlling guest access and what they can actually do. All right, so oops, there's my cursor. We're going to go specifically here into restricting guest access and then some of the settings so that we can prevent unwanted sharing. Now, the first thing I'll point out is that when we start working with this in the admin centers, this actually happens across about like 5 or 6 different places. There's not one switch that you have to work with. There's like 5 or 6 places that we have to work with, and I'm going to show those in the next couple of slides. But it does get a little frustrating, and the admin centers are maturing. So like, for example, the SharePoint admin center and the OneDrive admin center are merging. The Teams admin center, some things are done through PowerShell, and then they're being rolled out as part of the graphical interface. So it just kind of happens over time within there. So these are the main places to review. So with that, first and foremost, if you go into the Microsoft 365 Admin Center, you head down to Settings and you expand on Org Settings. Inside of there, you're going to find Microsoft Teams, Microsoft 365 Groups, and you're going to find SharePoint options. So I go into Microsoft Teams, I select that, and I'm going to see Allow Guest Access inside of Teams. That's actually turned on by default unless I turn that off. So that's one of the first places that I need to work with guest access. Next up, moving into Microsoft 365 Groups, it's in the same area. So your Admin Center, you're in Settings, you're in Org Settings, you got Microsoft 365 Groups. Click on that, and then you've got Let Guest Group Members Access Group Content. So that's going to allow us to bring guests inside of the Microsoft 365 Groups. That'll apply to Teams and SharePoint. And then if you go into the Admin Center, again, we're in Settings and we're in Org Settings. You'll find SharePoint listed there, and then we have some sharing options here, and then we have some advanced external sharing options, but most of that's going to redirect us over to the SharePoint Admin Center. So a lot of that's actually going to be maintained over there. Now, if we go into the SharePoint Admin Center, the first place you'll come across is your active sites. You can select a site and you're going to see an option underneath the Policies tab on the right-hand side, and that's going to be for external sharing. That's going to tell you if the site can be shared externally or not. That's going to allow some of that external access into that. When you expand external sharing, you're going to see options for anyone, new and existing guest only people in the organization. Now, I took this from a demo tenant with demo settings, and so the default there was actually only people in the organization. If I want to go ahead and open that up to guest access, I would do like new and existing guests inside of there. It's a new tenant, so that would be the option I would use for that. And then just below that, there's the default sharing link type. So once we start opening it up, we can also choose the level of sharing there. We'll talk more about that in just a moment. Now, also in the SharePoint Admin Center, if you go down the left-hand navigation, you get your policy section, expand that, and you're going to click on sharing. That's going to bring you to the external sharing options. This is going to allow us to choose the content that from SharePoint and OneDrive that can be shared, and that does have an impact inside of Teams, because Teams is built on top of that. But it's going to allow us to see some of the external sharing options. You can choose like the link type that users are going to be able to work with. For example, one of the guidelines Microsoft recommends is to minimize the anyone link, use new and existing guests or people in the organization, and turn off anyone, and that's going to help to prevent a lot of external access or sharing access. You're going to have your file and folder links that you can work with in there. We're going to dive through a couple of these in some additional slides coming up. But this is in the SharePoint Admin Center sharing, and then some of these policies will apply to SharePoint, OneDrive, and by extension Teams. Now, we can restrict guests based off of their domain. So this is one of the things that once we turn on guest access, we can restrict it by domains. Go into the Admin Center, the SharePoint Admin Center, go into your policies here, and then you're going to see a section it's in the center of the screen, more external sharing settings. Expand that, and the very first option you actually have is limit external sharing by domain. Now you can go in and you can pick the domains you want to allow, or you can block specific domains if you need. Now these users, they're going to have to log in somehow. So like, say for example, we're adding them to Teams, we enter in their email address, Andy@gmail.com, for instance. That's going to be what they would log in as. Like, we could block that domain if we wanted, or we could specifically allow that, and that would help us to work with like some external entities or business partners. So transitioning off of that, those are some of the settings. We'll kind of come back and talk about that. Let's talk about secure external sharing. Specifically, how can we configure secure external sharing for users outside of the organization? Now, this is a screenshot from the previous webinar that I mentioned. This is the actual link to get to it. It was external sharing. It's on the syskit.com website. So, sign up, check that out. It's about 45-minute deep dive into some of this. I'm just going to give you the highlights of that because I've already done a deep presentation on that. But a couple of things that I want to point out around this. In this system, Microsoft 365, we have this share button. And when we start adding people like guests and we start adding members into our SharePoint sites, controlling how we share content is also part of this conversation that we have to have. Not only do we allow like guests in, but our users can share content, and we want some control over that because they might share content outside of the settings that we have for like external or guest access. So the share button is going to be a big part of that. The share button shows up in SharePoint and like document libraries related to documents or folders. It's inline or it's up in the command bar at the top. If you're in OneDrive for Business or work, OneDrive for Work, whatever we're calling it this month, you'll have a document or a folder. There's an inline share link, but it's also in the command bar up at the top there as well. If you're working in Office, like Word, Excel, PowerPoint, there's a share command built right into the web version of Office, but also built into the desktop applications. It's usually in the top right-hand corner, and that allows the same share commands that we just saw. Um, uh, and then you've also got your sync client. The OneDrive sync client allows you to synchronize content from SharePoint and OneDrive to your local file explorer or to your local Finder window. And then with that synchronization, there is an option to share directly from there. So you can actually uh, share from that sync client and grant access to some of that uh, those files locally. And the thing about the OneDrive sync client is because it works with both OneDrive and SharePoint, and Teams is built on SharePoint, you could technically synchronize the contents coming from your channels and your files tab and share that information um, externally from there. So there's going to be some controls around that we need to consider as well. And then new, and this is in the process of actually rolling out, we have the ability to share directly from Teams. Like, so you upload a file in a channel using the attachment option, there's going to be a drop down and it's going to say share, and you're going to be able to share right from there. So if there's a guest, the guest is going to have access to that file inside of the team. But if you share it inside of the team, you're going to be able to use that share command to share it outside of the team. So what can we do about that? What can we do about some of the share settings so that not only we can control guest access, but also how our users share content, so we can kind of minimize that. And really the tools that you're going to use for that, there's 4 different levels of it. I'm going to walk through the admin center options now, whether it's in Azure AD, down to Microsoft 365 groups, but also SharePoint and the OneDrive settings. Oops. So going back to the share menu in the SharePoint Admin Center. So we're in policies, we're underneath sharing, and we've got the options here for content can be shared with. And notice the default there. Most permissive for both SharePoint and OneDrive is anyone. So the recommendation is lower that, either new and existing guests, or only people in the organization. Now you can lower one without impacting the other. So for example, you can lower OneDrive and make it more permissive. So like you can lower it from anyone to new and existing guests without actually impacting SharePoint. But if you start lowering the SharePoint toggle, the OneDrive toggle has to come down to have the same level of restriction on that. So with that, the recommendation from Microsoft is lower the option for anyone down to new and existing guests. This is going to be org-wide, and this will impact teams as well. So each site, though, can have its own sharing settings independently. That's a per site basis that can actually apply. So each site can have a restriction that's a little bit higher or a little bit lower than other sites that are out there. And the other thing that you can actually do with some of the sharing is each site that you work with, you can have certain security groups that have access to that level of external sharing without actually applying that to the other sites. So it can be security group driven as well. And that's one of the options that you actually see inside of there is allow users in security domains. So you just see here in this little screenshot, I'm lowering the SharePoint permissions, and you see it's affecting OneDrive, but as I raise SharePoint back up, it doesn't impact OneDrive, whereas OneDrive can be maintained independently of SharePoint for that security permission control. All right, a couple other things related to what we're talking about here with the file and folder links. We can choose the type of links that are going to show up there, what it defaults to, whether we're allowing people in our organization to share, specific people, or just anyone with a link. We can also choose the default, whether they're going to be able to edit or whether they're going to be able to view content. And then we can choose expiration dates. And the expiration dates allow us to create links and share and then have it expired so guests don't have access beyond certain limits, and we don't have to worry about cleaning that up as much. The link expiration, we can require the anyone link to expire. Users can set a shorter window for expiration in some cases, but they cannot extend it beyond what we define in the admin center. But we can also specify whether that anyone link works for files or folders and kind of differentiate if we need. Now the per site policy, you have to go back into the SharePoint Admin Center for this, go to sites, choose active sites, select the site by clicking on the name of the site, and the sharing window pops up. You'll go to policies, external sharing, you'll get to this window, and then you'll see what the defaults are there for a per site basis. It's anyone. You can actually lower that to new and existing guests only people in the organization. You can limit by domain on a per site basis as well. And then the default sharing link type, same as the organization. This is where you can change it and make it independent of the rest of the sites out there. And just to put that into context, so just zooming in a little bit, the external sharing defaults to anyone. So if we're allowing guest sharing, this is also going to apply to external sharing of content using the share command. This is where we would want to lower it maybe to new and existing guests. And this is what it applies to from the end user perspective. So this is the admin setting that we have. This is the end user perspective over here. This is what we're talking about. When they click that share button, this is the menu that they see. In my organization, anyone with the links turned off because that's a transferable link. We'll talk about that in a second. And you can pass that link around and anybody can access that content. I don't want that. So I default to like people in the organization and I turn the anyone with the link off. But there might be a one-off situation where you need either more open or more restrictive, and we can do that on a per site basis. Also notice here in the link settings dialog box that down at the bottom, there's the expiration date. We have the ability to, as end users, set an expiration date shorter than the company policy. Now, giving people permissions to the site, the group, or the team essentially gives them access to all of the content inside of there. If you want to share individual files or access, this is how you do it. So I might need somebody external to the company to have access to a couple of files, but I don't want to rebuild my entire permission model or my Microsoft 365 group model or add them to my entire team. The share option is how I can do some of that. Now, the next couple of slides, high level, just break down what we went in much more detail in that other webinar about, but anyone is a transferable link and it's anyone internal or external to the company. I could send it to you, you could pass that link around, and that's gonna grant access to that file. This is the one that essentially we wanna turn off. People in the organization means you have to log in as part of my organization in order to use this link. So you have to be, user@andyscompany.com. It's going to verify who you are, and then it will allow you to access the content based off the other settings that I define. That link is transferable. So I could send it to you internal in the company, and you could send it to another user internal in the company. But if you try to pass that outside of the company, it's actually not going to work. This one, though, you do have to authenticate in order to use it. We also have people with existing access. These are the people that already have access to the content through a SharePoint group, through Microsoft 365 membership, or through Teams membership to that content. So this is really just a link to give them access to something that they already have access to. And this specific people, this is the one that I actually prefer. I wish I could set this as the default and just kind of roll with it everywhere. But specific people means only the people whose email addresses that I define can actually use this link. You cannot pass it. You cannot transfer it to anyone else. So this link is non-transferable. This link could be anyone internal to the company, but it could also be anyone external to the company, including guests. And the user has to authenticate. So like if I send this to an external user, they get a link to click on, and then they get another link to verify to that same email address that they are actually trying to activate and use that link. And if they try to pass it to someone else, it's not going to work. If it's internal to the company specific, it's going to ask them to authenticate, just log in, and then they'll be able to use that. All right. So I mentioned this in passing. I just want to kind of go back and address it a little bit more. If I'm in the SharePoint Admin Center, I go to sharing. I can actually, underneath more external sharing settings, I can manage security groups. And one of the things that I can actually do is add a security group to the external sharing sites, and only members of that security group would be able to share that content with guests who authenticate. Now, getting a little bit deeper and a little bit outside of the scope that I'm comfortable with, but I would tell you that there are some people that do a whole bunch with sensitivity labels. I would definitely recommend their content. There are some things you can do with sensitivity labels that apply to your Microsoft Teams, your Microsoft 365 groups, and your SharePoint sites that can help you to protect content for something like a guest. And applying a sensitivity label applies it to the container. And then that label, once it's applied to the container, can be passed down into the content that's inside of it. So we could have a sensitivity label like maybe confidential all employees, and limit the access to that content to just the employees of the organization. So with this one, like you might have like a private or a public set of Teams or Microsoft 365 groups. We could put a container level classification on top of that. That would in turn also apply protection to that. That can limit external user access. That can limit external sharing, and we can just do it from the Security and Compliance Center. We can also control access from unmanaged devices in order to use this, and there's an authentication context tool that's rolling out in preview right now around that. So just a couple of things to kind of put this in review and bring it all together. Some best practices, covered some of that along the way. But one of the things that's really neat in the Azure AD Center is we can actually set up a guest access review, and we can do that on a repeating period inside of our Microsoft 365 environment. So when you require the access review, you can set it up for guests specifically, and then we can choose the reoccurrence based off of that review, whether weekly, quarterly, annually, the duration within that. And we just set up an automatic review period for owners to go back and review various teams and groups and clean out and get rid of the guest that might have access to like a Microsoft team. And so it's automated. We don't have to manually go back and ping our users to do that. So that is something that's built into Azure AD. There's a few other considerations that we need to make. I try to pick some of the bigger bullet points associated with this. This is a topic that we can definitely spend more than 40 minutes on. But with that, I do want to turn it back over to our friends here at Syskit. They have some more that they want to contribute to this, and then I'm going to stick around for some of the Q&A in just a few minutes.
We can throw things over to Igor. Igor, are you there?
Okay.
Oh, there we go. We see Syskit Point. Igor, you're ready to go.
Yeah, okay. Perfect. Thank you. I'll just jump right into Syskit Point. So first, let me just tell you once more that Syskit Point is a comprehensive Office 365 governance solution built for admins and business users, and it helps them govern all of their resources from a single interface, so you can manage everything easily. Syskit Point comes, as Mattia already mentioned a couple of times, with governance policies enforcement, with automated access review, with reporting and access management. So you have a lot of different tools, and I will just show a couple of features here. So since I lost some time with the technical issues, I'll just jump right into the site's overview screen here. And here at the first glance, you can already see that I have some sharing information here that is quite valuable. So I can here easily detect that some of my teams have, for example, here, if I look into the QA team, that it has the anyone sharing option. So defined here. So anyone from my team can share and create anonymous links. So I'm not sure if I'm comfortable with that. And from this screen, I can easily change that sharing setting. So I can change it as Andy suggested to new and existing guests or existing guests only. But usually when it comes to sharing, I want to find out some more details about what kind of content is actually shared and to whom. So here, if I dive into the QA team details screen, here in the overview tile, I can see some additional information. So for example, I can see here that I have some anonymous links. And as Andy mentioned, these cannot be controlled and virtually anyone can gain access to my content, which is not really the best practice. So here with a single click, I can select all of them and remove them, or maybe select just a couple of them and remove those. The next thing that I want to take a look at is the list of external users. So I can access that easily here from also the screen. Simply drill to the external users report and I get a full list of all external users. So this list actually shows the guest users, so the users that are actually in my Azure Active Directory, but also the ad hoc users that or external users that Andy mentioned that only gain access to specific people links. So here from this screen, I can easily remove access for some of these users if I see that they are from a wrong domain that I'm really not comfortable with sharing the content with. So I can easily remove access here. Additionally, I can also select the user and generate different reports. So all of these here actions and reports are contextual. So depending on the selection, the objects for that user will show up in the generated report. So I will generate the user access report here. And here I can see all of the documents, files, and folders that are shared with that external user. From all of the reports that I will show you, and this one also, you can have the capability to remove access or edit access. So for permissions that are given directly to the external user, or maybe if they are given through a sharing link, you can also remove that sharing link or that person from the link. The next thing that I can do is also check out the activity of the external user. So I'm interested maybe what Alex did in my environment. So I can generate the user activity report. So here I have filtered out all of the events for that user in my team. So I can see that Alex did some modifications here on the files, accessed some files, created folders, and so on. So if I have something suspicious going on in my environment, I can easily check out everything that happened and led to some critical issues in my environment. The next thing I want to show you is the externally shared content report. So you can also easily access it here from the right side panel when you're on the details screen of a certain team that you're focusing on. So before I focused on the external user, but I want to know which content is actually externally shared. So no matter if to Alex or some other external users, and I will also get a complete overview of all of the sharing links. So I can see that I have some sharing links here. This is an anonymous link, so shared to anyone. I can easily remove the link with a single click. If some of the access is given directly to the external users, I can select the user and also edit the permissions or remove completely, so that user will no longer have access to my content. The next thing I can do is to go to the report center. So all of the reports that I mentioned here that are actually available in this contextual menu, I can also generate for all different resources that I'm the owner of. So here in the report center, I have all of these reports available for generating. So for example, if I'm just concentrated on the sharing links, I can generate that. I will select again my QA team because I'm currently interested in that team. And I can select the type of the link that will be displayed in the generated report. Since the anyone links or anonymous links are a security issue, I just want to take a look at them. So I generate the report and I can see all of the objects that were shared via an anonymous link. As before and on all reports, I can easily select an object and I can remove sharing link from that object. And we also actually coupled all of that with the access reviews that also Matija talked about before. So I will navigate to my tasks where I can see the access review task. And I can also navigate here to my team. So here I'm the owner. And I will be able to see the members. And easily with the top filters that are available here, I can filter out the guest users. And if I'm not comfortable with that user being in my team, I can simply remove the user from the group. But also in the next step, I can do a lot of managing. So I can see everything that I actually mentioned before in the externally shared content reports and the user access reports. So they are also integrated here in the access review. And you can see that I can easily with the filters see all of the anonymous links or everything that is shared externally via specific people links or in some other way. Of course, also from this report, you can manage the access, so remove it or remove the whole sharing link. So once I'm done, I will have a complete overview of all of my actions and I can complete the review. But I will close that and continue later since I have one more thing to show you. So something similar that Andy talked about for the guest users review. We also in the latest version of Syskit Point have the guest user expiration policy. So you can define that Syskit Point will send an email and create a review task for guest users that are discovered to be inactive for a defined period of time. So here I also have my previously mentioned guest user Alex. So he was inactive and when the guest user expiration task was created, so I got an email and I have this nice task where I can decide whether to remove or keep the user. And in that way, I can keep my environment tidy and clean and secure. So all of the information is available in the activity timeline. You can even define that Syskit Point will remove inactive guest users automatically, so you don't have to deal with that kind of stuff. And that's about it. That's a quick overview of all of the external and guest user access and reporting and management. So I will give it back now to Tony.
Yeah, and I hope you can hear me now. I had a small technical issue in between. So if Andy is still with us, we still do have some questions, and I invite everybody to post questions in Q&A. So Andy, this is what we got during your session. So the first question is regarding the time limit on links, sharing links. So the question is, can we specify a different time limit for OneDrive compared to that we set up for SharePoint, or the setting is shared between the two?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that for me, please?
So for the sharing links where you can define the expiration limit on the number of days, is this setting shared between SharePoint and OneDrive, or there is a
Yes.
separate option? Okay, it's shared.
Yeah. As far as I remember, yes, it is shared between both SharePoint and OneDrive.
Okay. In your experience, the other question is, what is the best practice of who in the company should be reviewing these guests and their access to sites?
Uh, clearly the admins are going to be part of that conversation, IT pros, but really we want that to eventually extend in some situations down to the site owners. I know many organizations have limited resources, especially when it comes to the number of admins that they are employing in order to manage these services. For example, I've worked with a healthcare organization, and we have for part of the Microsoft Teams and SharePoint work that I do, we have 5 to 10 admins managing 25,000 users. So anytime we can extend that from just the admin role down into some of our Teams owners and have them proactively cleaning up and working with some of that, that's an added bonus for us. It helps us to extend our resources. But for some of these things, like for example, using the Azure AD tool to go back and set the review periods, that's going to be an admin-based application. And then we're going to try and work with the team owners to get to that point, but it's going to fall mainly to, a lot of it's going to fall in the admin's lap.
Mhm. And in your opinion, when we are talking about external users, would you say that the best practice is to create these in Active Directory by IT, or the best practice is to allow for users to like invite those from those domains that were like on the white list or on the allowed list directly from their sharing interface?
Ideally, we want to know where the users are coming from. A lot of times, like healthcare, for instance, is highly regulated. We're going to have a specific set of partners and entities that we work with. So we're going to want to have a whitelist for those specific domains and those users, and we want to have that process in place. Depending on the business, though, those needs could change. And I'll tell you, if you don't have a whitelist around some of those domains, you're going to have, if you have a more open environment, you're going to have users coming from a lot of different domains. And as guests, they are going to be in your Active Directory as well as in your teams and your sites. And so cleaning them up and removing them periodically is going to be part of the maintenance that you have to do, even outside of just the whitelisting.
Mm-hmm. Another question revolves again around external users, and the question is what is the best way to lock down these users so they can only access meetings but not files?
That's going to be a combination of settings and policies. We have there are meeting policies that we can define. There's a global meeting policy, and then there's individual meeting policies that you can define, and you can use that to target specific entities. And it depends on what we mean by external user, because I try to clarify at the beginning, an external user is different than a guest. An external user might be coming from a organization that we work with closely. They're going to be able to attend those meetings, but the policies are really going to define how we can lock it down and prevent people from working with meetings outside of the scope of what we want to control.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And in your experience, what is the best way to track files which can be shared outside of team or outside of tenant?
So external sharing of files, keeping track of that. Well, clearly Syskit has a pretty good tool. The user interface and the simplification of that is something that definitely minimizes some of the friction that we have to do inside of the Microsoft 365 admin centers to get to some of that. Some of the effective things that I've seen employed by some of my colleagues in the industry deals a lot with PowerShell and scripting. They've been able to generate reports, export to CSV, and then use that for reporting. But if you can use a tool that can simplify that, that's definitely going to be something that can help.
Okay, Andy, thank you so much for your session. It's always good to refresh the knowledge of external users because it gets more complicated as we go, but it definitely helps people to communicate and collaborate with external partners and vendors in the same system. It's definitely very helpful. Okay, so thank you everybody for joining us for today's session. You're going to be receiving a recording to your email, so that's going to be helpful if you want to review some of the sessions. So our team will be in contact in a couple of days with all those materials. Thanks, Andy, and hope to see you soon again in one of our webinars. Thank you so much,
Thank you so much.
and goodbye.
Take care.